Okay, 8.8, solve by completing the square. This is going to be the one that you hate the most. So don't be surprised if you need to watch a video a couple times. You need to pause, rewind, rewatch, try again. We will spend 2 days on this because it usually takes, once you get it, it's not too bad, but it usually takes a day or so to get. So be patient, okay? Completing the square. What does that mean? Completing the square means that we want to have a perfect square. So we have done perfect squares before. So let me give you an example. If I have this problem right here, x squared plus 8x plus 16. Okay, now when I asked you to factor this, there was 2 ways we could go about it. We'd check to see if this was a perfect square, right? Check to see if this was a perfect square. We would multiply these two together and we would double them to get this. And then it was a perfect square, right? So let's do another one. X squared plus minus 12x plus 36. Take the square root of this, take the square root of this, multiply these two together and double them to get this, and then it's a perfect square. So this is our whole goal. Our goal of this method is called completing the square. So our goal of this method is to complete the square. It's going to make things very easy for us. So let me give you a problem here. If I gave you x squared plus 6x plus something, and we're going to complete that square. Okay, so we're going to complete that square. So think about where this number came from. We square rooted this, and because there's nothing here, it was just an x. So we square rooted this and we doubled it. We square rooted this and we doubled it. So I want to know how to get back to there. So if the last thing we did is doubled it, what's the first thing that we should do? We should chop that in half. So we should chop that in half. So we square rooted and we doubled. So we're going to chop it in half and we're going to square it. So chop this in half and square it, and now I have a perfect square. Now if we look at this, square root of this is 3. Square root of that is x. We multiply those two together and double them and we get 6. So if I have something, whatever, minus 14 plus something. So here's the rule. What we're going to do, if I want to make this a perfect square, before I square rooted and I doubled, so now I'm going to chop in half and I'm going to square. So I chop that in half, I get 7. 7 times 7 is 49. Now this is a perfect square. So the big thing with this method is completing the square. So we need to turn this into a perfect square. So this is the first step. So basically, this is exactly what we just said. If I want to turn this into a perfect square, I'm going to chop this in half and double it. So here's the rule that you want to write in your notes. B over 2 squared. Okay? So put it in standard form. We always have our A, and then our B, and then our C. So we're going to take B, we're going to chop it in half, and we're going to square it. So take the 6, chop it in half, we get 3. Square that, we get 9. So that's going to be the rule we're going to use. Okay? So complete these squares. So do this quick. Pause it, and we'll come back together. Okay, so b over 2. This is my b. So b over 2. 2 divided by 2. I chop it in half. I get 1. I square 1, and I get 1. Negative 6. Chop it in half. I get negative 3. But what is a negative times a negative? It's always going to turn positive. So chop it in half, I get 3. 3 times 3 is 9. Chop this in half, I get 6. 6 times 6 is 36. Chop this in half, this is going to be annoying. I get 2.5. Square that, and I get 6.25. Okay? Did this one catch you? That one is not in standard form. So if we clean that up, we've got x squared plus 8x plus something. So now chop this in half. We get 4. Square it. I get 16. Okay, so that's first step. So if you got that down, we're in good shape. Okay, write these steps all down. Just like it says, pause it, and then we'll do a problem. Okay, so step number 1 is the equation in the correct form. Now when we do this method, we're always going to put the c value on the other side. Okay, and this is how I'm going to write it. So step 1, we're going to put the c value on the other side, and then this is how I'm going to write it. X squared plus 16x plus something equals negative 15 plus something. Okay? So what is that something? The idea is we want to complete the square. So this, if I cover up, if I look at just this half of the problem, this is just doing what you did on the last slide. Okay? How do I complete the square? I find b over 2 right here. So I take this, I chop it in half, and I square it. So this would be step number 1. This is step number 2. Chop it in half and square it. Step number 3 says we'll add that to both sides. If I chop this in half, I get 8. Square that, I get 64. I can add anything I want to any equation in the whole wide world as long as I do what? As long as I do it to both sides. Okay? Step number 4 says factor it and simplify. So here's what we're going to do. Okay, so we just added it to both sides. So this part right here means, now that this is a perfect square, I want to factor it. So basically, I'm doing what multiplies to 64 and adds to 16. What does multiply to 64 and adds to 16? It better be the same thing, otherwise this is not a perfect square. And the title of this is completing the square. So this is 8 and 8. Now you're going to notice this is always what you got when you chop that in half. So when you chop this in half, b over 2, we chopped it in half and got 8. That's always the thing we square. That is going to be the perfect square. So I could write this as x plus 8 and x plus 8, but if it's a perfect square, why don't I just call it a perfect square? Okay, so that's the factor part. The simplify part means just do what this says. This says negative 15 plus 64. So negative 16 plus 64 equals 49. Okay? Now, this is a square sign, and that's got all of my x wrapped up. So if I want to undo a square, how do I undo a square? This comes in from what we learned yesterday. I square root. So step 5 says take the square root of both sides. If I take the square root of this side and I take the square root of this side, the square and the square root cancel each other out. So I get x plus 8 equals plus or minus 7. Okay? Now step number 6 says now write 2 equations and solve them, because how many answers do I usually have when I do a quadratic? I usually have 2 answers. So my first equation is going to be x plus 8 equals 7. My second equation is going to be x plus 8 equals negative 7. And if I solve both of these, if I minus 8 and I minus 8, I get x equals negative 1. Minus 8 minus 8, I get x equals negative 15. And there are my 2 answers. And now you could plug both of those in and you could double check, and I promise they're right. Okay, but I don't want to have to do 2 videos and I'm talking a lot, so I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Okay, so don't be afraid if you have to watch this more than once. I'm going to do a couple examples, and then you have lots of homework time, and you can come back, you can re-watch these examples, you can do them again. So let me do this one down here at the bottom. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to get this to the other side. Okay, so my equation is going to be t squared minus 8t plus something equals, if I move that to the other side, it's 5. So 5 plus something. Now that plus something that goes there is always going to be b over 2 squared. So I chop this in half, I get 4. I square it, I get 16. I can add anything to any equation I want, as long as if I do it to one side, I have to do it to the other side. Okay, and when I do the homework, I would put these lines here and I'd fill in the lines and take your time. Okay, now we factor it. Do not put your notes away when you do your homework. Follow it step by step by step. So now I factor. I factor what multiplies to 16 and adds to -8, which is -4 and -4. And it better be the same thing, else it's not a perfect square. And again, it's always what you just chopped in half. I just chopped that in half, I got -4, so it's -4 and -4. So I've got t minus 4 squared. I'm not going to write it twice, I'm going to call it squared. This side, I'm just going to add them up. So that side equals 21. Okay? Now, how do I undo a square? I square root. If I square root one side, I got to square root the other. So I get t minus 4, because these just cancel, equals, if I take the square root of 21, I get plus or minus 4.58. Okay, now I'm going to scoot up here. So I've got t minus 4 equals 4.58. T minus 4 equals -4.58. And now I just solve. Plus 4 plus 4. T equals 8.58. Plus 4 plus 4. T equals -0.58. Okay? Let's try to squeeze one more problem in. Now, this one here, there was a giant note, a big flashy star thing, hopefully you wrote it down, that said you have to get rid of whatever is in front. Okay? So if I want to get rid of that, I'm going to divide everything, I'm going to divide both sides, everything by -3. And when I do that, I'm going to get x squared minus 4x plus 5, and 0 divided by anything is 0. Okay, now I'm also going to make sure I move this to the other side. So I'm going to get x squared minus 4x plus something equals -5 plus something. Okay, now what is that plus something? It's going to be, we're going to chop this in half and square it. So I chop it in half, I get 2. 2 times 2 is 4. Doesn't really matter if I just call it -2 or 2, because what's -2 times -2? It's still going to be positive 4. If I add something to one side, I have to add it to the other side. And now I'm going to factor this. What multiplies to 4 and adds to -4? It's always going to be what you just chopped in half. So it's going to be x minus 2 squared. I just do what it says over here. -5 plus 4 equals -1. Take the square root to get rid of that square. If I square root one side, I have to square root the other side. And what just happened here? Can I take the square root of a negative? I cannot. So as soon as I do this, guess what? No solution. Okay, looks like I have time for one more, so let me do this one really quick. We already have this on the other side, so I've got x squared plus 10x plus something equals -9 plus something. So chop this in half. I get 5. Square the 5, I get 25. If I add it to one side, I have to add it to the other side. So what multiplies to 25 and adds up to 5, or adds up to 10, I'm sorry, is 5 and 5. And again, it better be, else we did not complete the square. So I get x plus 5 squared. This side, I just do what it says. Add them up, I get 16. If I want to get rid of the square, I square root one side, I square root the other side. So I get x plus 5 equals plus or minus 4. X plus 5 equals 4. X plus 5 equals minus 4. So if I subtract the 5 and subtract the 5, I get x equals -1. Subtract the 5, subtract the 5, I get x equals -9. Okay, that's all we have time for. Don't worry if it takes you an extra day or so to figure it out.